Hello.
Hey, yeah, Jasmine, we're going to be going. Um, we're live right now, but we'll get started in a couple minutes. So I don't know if you want to stay muted till then.
Wonderful. Will do.
Okay. Got about a minute. I'm just going to give Leetal a little more time to get here. This is my high-tech, low-tech version of a countdown clock. Still figuring out how to do the streaming that all the young folks are into these days. Don't ask me what that voice was. All right. It's like, hello. Hello. I wish I could have a cuckoo clock on my smart clock watch or my phone. I just want like a cuckoo bird who's going to come out at the top of every hour and annoy the hell out of me. All right. All right. So let's get started then. We're going to stop sharing and we're going to get this going, and hopefully Leetal is able to come in soon. But as always with technology, you never know exactly how it's going to work. So we will go from here. And I know Jasmine has been on dialogues before, but this is Marty's first time. So Marty, welcome. I'm glad to have you here. The basic way we do this is we just kind of talk. We don't really do presentations or anything. We just kind of talk through the topic for the day and kind of go where the conversation takes us. So I want to thank everyone for coming to today's popular culture dialogue, where we're going to be talking about queering popular culture. So issues of LGBTQIA plus representation in popular culture, as well as any issues when it comes to the reception of that popular culture and those representations. So the way we also start is that I throw it to you to introduce yourself and what brings you here. And Jasmine, you're our returning guest, so maybe you can model how to do it and give Marty a little bit more time to think through how to do it as well. And good, okay, we have Dean coming in. So Dean, we'll have you introduce yourself as well. But Jasmine, if you could.
Absolutely. So hello, my name is Jasmine Stork. I am a recently graduated PhD student at Ohio State University. So I just graduated with my doctorate in comparative studies, so cultural studies. Thank you. And I studied asexuality in fan fiction, so representations of asexuality in fan fiction using a folklore approach. So I was really interested in not just what was happening, but how people were talking about it. And especially for my interests adjacent to public health, what the utility is of thinking about how people engage in fan studies and with popular culture online, especially in the asexual community and queer communities more broadly, since there was a lot of connecting and passing through for the asexual people that I talked to.
I forgot I muted myself. Congratulations then, Dr. Stork. Marty, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Sure. Hey, everybody. My name is Marty. I use they, them pronouns. I am currently a third-year PhD student at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Yeah, finally back in Chicago after being elsewhere for 18 months. So, happy to be back. And I, did my master's thesis on representations of sexual violence on television. And, I think historically there's been a lot of that's been very straight. But I looked specifically at assaults of male characters as well and how those are portrayed, which was very interesting. There is this British soap opera that I'm a big fan of called Hollyoaks, where the main queer relationship for 4 years started out with very dramatic domestic abuse. And then, but we love them and they're the only gays here. And so then they did a redemption arc, which okay, but so anyway, I'm interested in that. And then I've also been doing a lot of work on relationship of men loving men and women loving women, relationships specifically in historical fiction, and how we imagine things as historical fiction makes people think that that's how things really were, right? And so when we only have closeted spies blackmailing each other and murdering each other, everyone's oh my God, gay people either didn't exist because a lot of historical fiction doesn't have them, or they're all it's inherently this negative thing that kind of defines their lives. So anyway, apologies. I'll dial it back. That's where I'm at right now.
No, that's fantastic. Seeing as how this is the first time we've had you on one of these dialogues, having this background to your research is fantastic. And I think that's what you were just talking about is kind of going to lead into my first question that I have to hopefully generate us a good discussion today. So thank you for that. And then I'm going to go down to below me, at least on the screen, we have Dean Leetal.
Dean Leetal. I also use they, them. All your works seem so interesting. I'm really excited to learn more about them, really. So I just finished my master's and then COVID messed up my plans. Thank you. But hopefully I'm going to continue as planned-ish. I'm in the process of publishing a few papers about non-binary gender and fandom and television. I'm working on like one paper about themes in named representations, official representations, and a few about characters that are coded as non-binary in fan fiction and supernatural.
Awesome, fantastic. I think I'm just going to leave my mic unmuted so I don't have to keep going back and forth, and I can jump in. And feel free to do so as well if you're in an environment that allows it to be done. And I will say I haven't studied much in this area. My partner and I, Chris Olson and I, we did publish an anthology looking at non-traditional sexualities and gender identities in children's media. So quick plug for heroes, heroines, and everything in between. But there is one area that I'm interested in, and I just haven't formulated an idea for how to approach it yet. So maybe this discussion will help me. And it's looking at queer representation in professional wrestling, because there is a lot more of it today, and not just in the professional wrestling, but kind of in the ancillary paratexts, I guess, that surround it. Especially in AEW, they have a YouTube show called Being the Elite, and there's a faction called the Dark Order that are on that show. And they engage in some really interesting male bonding, let me put it that way. It's really fascinating how they're approaching those relationships. So that's definitely something I want to think about, and I'm glad to have this conversation and hopefully get some great ideas from that regard. And I will say, if anyone is watching who would like to ask any questions or provide us with any comments, I am monitoring our YouTube where this is streaming, so I can see the chat in case anything comes up there. So feel free to pop in and put something there if you like. But all right, let's get started kind of then with my first question. And it may seem like a really broad question. That may be a good place to start. How has queer representation changed in popular culture? That's a big, broad one, right? You're gonna throw the big one at you first.
I love it. So I will say that one of the things that is maybe a little bit different for me is that my approach for studying popular culture is actually through fandom studies, through fan studies. So I personally actually spend a lot less time thinking about the media itself than I do about what people are doing around that media. But because I was looking at asexuality, one of the things that has just been so significant is that there are finally, not very many, but finally a few actual recognized asexual characters in popular media. And that is huge because it has created an opportunity for people to not just say like, well, in my head, I understand that character to be asexual because of all these things. Let me explain it to you. Please don't ruin this for me. Like, there are finally at least a few characters, or at least some characters that like aren't explicitly not asexual. And that has been huge for fan activity because it gives everybody something to say, like, I don't have to justify thinking this character is asexual. They just are. And we can go from there. And that's pretty new just in the last several years. So at least for thinking about asexual conversations and queerness through asexuality in popular media, just having a few characters has opened a gateway. And part of that is just that other people now have heard that those characters are asexual. And it just creates another way of not needing to be the first asexual conversation somebody has. And I think that has contributed tremendously because now you can have a slightly different conversation than what is that? You can move on and say, well, you can just Google it. Google is free. you can Google that. And now we can talk about things that are more important, like all of the diversity within our community. And that really hasn't been on the table for a long time if you're talking to people who aren't asexual.
I know BoJack Horseman has an asexual representation, and it's something different than my partner's handing me about a game he's playing. But yeah, sorry, BoJack Horseman, and who are some others? I guess I'm not aware of them.
Harrido, I believe Steven Universe is one of the ones that is also very popular. There's a lot of conversation about the need for more like actually human people, asexual characters. Sherlock gets asexualized a lot. A little contentious, not so much the asexualizing, but how people feel about it. In the show Sex Ed, I believe, I have not watched that show, but we're starting to see more. There's not a huge number, and I will say a chunk of that number are like not explicitly asexual, but not explicitly not asexual, which is still something. It's something to be excited about just because of the possibility. And I think that I mean, Dean and Marty might have seen more of this, but I think that also comes up with gender non-binary characters and trans characters a little bit more also, just having some characters to start from has grown. It's not huge, but there are at least some recently.
Dean, you want to add to that?
On what you were saying about like human characters. I think that we've seen more human characters be kind of LGBTQIA plus, like across the board, right? I think we've had more bisexual representation and pansexual representation than we have gender nonconforming or trans or ace characters. But like even since like I was in middle school, and like the bisexual character that I knew of was Captain Jack Harkness from the Doctor Who universe. Like he's human, but like, is he though? Like, and his partners are not all human. And, there's a lot of kind of heightening of, okay, we can have this transgression like in space and fantasy and things like that. And so having like kind of grounded characters and also monogamous bisexual characters instead of kind of these, a lot of people would say Jack Harkness is not bisexual. He's like omnisexual, right? That he's just attracted to everything of every species and every gender. And so like, not that doesn't mean he could still be monogamous, right? He has that like relationship with Yonto. But it's kind of nice to see more grounded characters and also more male bisexual characters in monogamous relationships that aren't just like presented as like hypersexual all the time as the root of their pansexuality or bisexuality. So that's been fun. What do you think, Dean?
So non-binary characters seem to be in a similar place to asexual characters, even the same shows, some of them. So we have that. And of course, the non-human thing, and one of the very, very many non-binary characters are white, under 20, thin, queer haircut, expensive clothes. It's just blows my mind because most non-binary people are not full of those things. And then like one thing that I find, I'm delighted that in the past 3-ish years, there have been more and more. And I think you're getting more and more every year. And a lot of that, at least based on what creators and actors are talking about, is because actors or creators pushed for that. Like in Big Sky, there was a role that was supposed to be this absolutely horrible. It sounds like it would have been absolutely horrible. Uh, Role for a cisgender gay man. And the actress they chose for it is non-binary, and she basically taught them what non-binary was and how to write a character. So far they've published about how wonderfully inclusive they are in the media, but they haven't actually given any indication that it's a non-binary character on the show. But we'll see. So there are a lot of shows like that, but there are also a lot of named characters like in Steven Universe and She-Ra, those wonderful cartoons. It's exciting. At least I find it exciting.
I'm going to probably be showing my age here in a couple ways, but I think about how when I was growing up, especially in high school in the 1990s, and it would become like an event if you had two girls kissing on screen, whether it was they were actually lesbian or it was, a lesbian moment. And it was this very sensationalized thing. But now it sounds like we're getting more, it almost sounds like we have this tension now between seeking to normalize it and not make a big fuss about it or anything like that. And it is just what it is, compared to wanting to demonstrate that, we're progressive, we're inclusive, we've hired someone, but it's maybe not going as far as it needs to. Is that something that we're seeing happening across popular culture, at least in the United States?
Yes, that sounds absolutely like something that's going on.
Yeah, I think one of the people that I interviewed, I actually loved the way that they talked about this, because for them, the marker of like we're actually in a better place would actually be if we were doing more to abnormalize the traditional heterosexual, monogamous, married, nuclear family structure. Romantic and sexual is more important than platonic relationship structures. And so for them, part of it was saying it's not actually enough to just have more queer people, have more gender nonconforming people. Like just having more isn't correct, because it's still not really a reflection of how lives are lived and how we negotiate all of the changes that have happened in the last 60, 70, 80 years. And actually what would be more important or valuable or just helpful would actually be pushing against letting things like sexual and romantic relationships be the sort of normal high-end ones, pushing back against that and saying, well, but what if that isn't how we represent these things? What if we refuse this, or we don't let that feel normal? Because it's a normal relationship, but it's not the most, and it's not the only. And for me, that was a really good conversation, because that is still looking at popular culture and popular media, whether it's in books or TV or film, or just the way that we sort of tell stories about our lives. We still are using the same structures. We just might be adding a few more people in, and that's not enough to change some of the problems that we're experiencing. We can't really change the problems if we keep the structure. And I think that is actually something that I'm not quite seeing yet. But of course you see it for queer creators if they've managed to just get through some of those gates. You're seeing some of those things happening in queer produced forms if they can get through. But there's still not much of that, because the gates are pretty darn high, and those gatekeepers are pretty well established.
Yeah, I would love to tack on to that regarding like family structure as well. So I totally agree with what you're saying about like we need to have different kinds of scripts for like romantic relationships and also sexual relationships that might not be romantic. And, you know, there's more inclusion of polyamory, which is great. And there's more inclusion of kind of like thruples are becoming, I feel like thruples are trending right now. Still very monogamous thruples, but like, okay. And like, that's all great. But I'm also doing some work focusing on like parenting and how we queer parenting gender roles. And you know, a lot of young people who either just have like divorced parents and remarried parents who might happen to be straight, or they have, you know, polyamorous parents, et cetera, or they have queer parents. They talk a lot about how having like more parents, bonus parents, is like so enriching to their lives. And like how they feel bad for people who only have two parents, right? Which is slightly problematic when we get into, you know, discussions of how we feel bad for single parents, like, but I think I would really love to see moving forward more visible representation of active co-parenting between platonic parents, et cetera, you know, like having kind of the queer family, like for kids, as opposed to like, I was kicked out, now I have my queer found family, which has always been a trend in queer stories and is fabulous. But like, people are growing up with very queer families right now, and I'd love to see that represented more.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Dean.
Yeah, I want to continue the family thing. I think that a lot of representations of non-binary people right now, they kind of don't know what narrative to tell. We don't have the coming out or the falling in love that gay people have. And a lot of stories are, well, some of them are exactly that, but a lot of stories kind of latch onto existing queer stereotypes that, or existing queer stereotypical narratives, because that's something to latch onto. So we have the non-binary best friend who's very supportive of the lead white straight thin girl in her romantic problems, and things like that. So like like you were saying about the stories need to be different, not just added on characters. The same thing I think is happening there. And I'm just going to turn on the light.
No, okay. So is there any place where you see this happening more? Is it like, it may not be like mainstream Hollywood, for example, because mainstream Hollywood, a lot of them are still very focused on what they believe middle America is, and they believe middle America cares more about nuclear family and traditional dynamics of relationships and so on and so forth. So are there any places that you see these representations happening more?
Well, I looked at fan fiction, so it's not quite fair because I was so focused on that. And of course it's there because that's where people get to make those choices and to make it look the way that we might prefer it to look, or that it actually does for most people. And I especially was looking at fandoms that have some sense of verisimilitude with the real world, some sense of like, this is just New York, but sometimes there are aliens with the Avengers, or like, this is London, but like, there's some weird stuff happening. So I was focused more on those than animated series or purely fantastic shows. Although I do have a soft spot for Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, which did come up with in the couple of my conversations. But there seemed to be a really important, at least difference in the way people talked about sort of what they're hoping for and what the possibilities are of shows that sort of feel like they're kind of our world, even with fantastic elements. versus shows where you're like, it's just outer space. This is purely fiction. Like, this doesn't need to be like the real world in any way, shape, or form. That's not what its job is. And that seemed to be a very important point of saying, like, if you're gonna be more like the real world, why wouldn't you make these choices to have more queer representation, to really change what the society could accept for family structures and social dynamics? And why do they look so American? Like, why aren't these Polynesian family structures? Why aren't these Chinese cultural elements? Like, why is this what it is when we have a whole world to pull from that is fascinating and beautiful and not the same? You could have so much more if you chose to even just broaden the representations of the real world in these. But that's really different from what people talk about for like Steven Universe, when you don't need things to feel like the real world for it to work. But I was mostly fan fiction and sort of fan activity. So that's where I see most of the really sort of active, intentional work in saying, what if we push? What are the places to add this back in or to push against those boundaries and representations?
I think that like the fantasy areas allow for approaching the other or and bringing in what may seem as alien and make it more comfortable, kind of like how you can use comedy at times to transgression, to push back as well.
Yes, and there's something really important about fantasy societies where you can't be wrong. If it's not a real group of people, you can't invent a social norm that's wrong. You just can't be wrong. But as soon as you're getting close to somebody who is really in the world, a culture, a group of people, and a national identity, we start to get a lot more pushback on the sort of the realness of it, the authenticity of it, which comes up a lot in folklore. But those are really interesting moments to see who's engaging, who's feeling threatened, who's feeling the potential of being seen or the reality of being ignored. It functions differently enough that some fantasy doesn't seem to interrupt that importance. Pure fantasy does.
Sorry, Dean, for cutting you off.
It's me. So you were asking about where we see it. A lot of Netflix shows, a lot of cartoons are wonderful, some of the best representations, and sometimes not so great representations in procedurals. I think there's this format in detective fiction where they bring in weird characters or like from the edges of society for us, the normal people, to observe and to learn about. So I feel that that format kind of works for a lot of non-binary characters, or well, a handful of non-binary characters, because there are not a lot of non-binary characters anywhere. And also kind of small characters and shows about families like One Day at a Time and This Is Us. It's kind of, those our teenagers speak a different language kind of trope. So the teenagers would be going out with someone non-binary and they get to make all their jokes about, pronouns.
The generational difference, and I guess that would be Gen X having those kids now, and yeah, using that to in terms of like an othering in some ways, and yeah.
I think it's Gen Z are being so weird with their middle parts and pronouns. I don't know.
Yeah, I want to grab onto what you said, Dean, too, about you're seeing a lot of this on Netflix. And I have found that, it's subscription-based platforms where like they have your money and they don't have to deal with advertisers, right? And so I think HBO has been doing a lot of, you know, actively queer content. People can fight about how they feel about the representation, but they're putting lots of queer content out there, right? Netflix is doing the same. When we're talking about like reimagining like quasi-realistic worlds and like opening up what we mean by diversity, like I think Sense8 is kind of a go-to example of kind of queerness as an ethos, right? Breaking down boundaries, we're all connected, yada yada. There's lots of queer characters, but then there's also straight characters who kind of end up in these like orgy situations, right? Which like shows a fluidity maybe in their sexuality, but also is like very pro self-love, right? And so, you know, again, people have their opinions about.
Marty said they were having technical issues, so it's okay. As we yeah, as we wait for Marty to come back, I want to say one thing that I think I'm hearing from both Dean and Marty is too. There's the sense of, like you said, there's that opt-in subscription platform that kind of in some ways represents more of a subculture and different subcultures. But then you have, like with the procedural shows on regular broadcast, whether it's over the air or cable, it's kind of like those take more almost like a sideshow, freak show, carnival approach to like what you said, the outsiders. And it is interesting to see those different areas. And do you think that having such differences in these queer representations, is that good for our society, or is that harmful for our society, or is it a mix of the two?
Oh man, I mean, I will always think that it's better to have more people's experiences or versions that are more like more people's experiences in the world. But I think this came up a little bit while Marty was talking just about the number of shows that are out there and the kind of queer content. It's important to recognize how much work it takes to get to all of that representation, right? If you have to be subscribed to 5 different services to find one show each, and if you have to seek out the books that have queer characters that other people in the queer community have said feel good or feel correct or feel sufficient. I mean, that's a lot of work in a way that still tells you that there's not that much if I have to spend hours to find something that's categorically similar. Like if it's just queer, if I still have to really work to find it and access it, regardless of what forms and identities and experiences of queerness are there, it's a lot more than there was, but that's not a lot if it takes that level of commitment just to know and to access. And I think that's significant. So there's lots out there, but compared to how much is out there, that's not really much at all. I'm sure Dean and Marty have also seen this, but you know, if you have to explain to everybody what the thing is, it's not as big as we need it to be to do the work that queer representation can do. And sometimes that work is just to be present and to be another way of being in the world. But sometimes that's much more significant work, right? Like knowing that it's there, being able to find people. I think COVID especially has been a really important moment for recognizing how much work our art and media does just to keep people okay or functioning. Mm-hmm. I think this is very similar, where all of a sudden you had a lot of people who are like, I need so much more. Where is it? How do I find it? Man, but that's still, they had to work hard. We're all working our butts off to get to that, which I think is not that itself is not a positive. If you're willing to have it, but it's not sort of everywhere, that's not a great signal.
Yeah. On on the same kind of note that you were talking about regarding having to find representation, one thing that I do think has been like a nice big change over the past decade is the amount of genres where we're seeing specifically gay and lesbian representation. Like Ryan Murphy has gone full on queer horror. And we have, like, I've studied a lot of queer people in historical fiction. And, it's like, okay, it was always kind of in sci-fi. And then we were getting like at least a little bit queer jokes on sitcoms. And, like maybe you'd have the gay best friend. And I feel like now it's pervasive. Like I was speaking to my grandmother this summer, and she was like, I'm so happy because your grandpa, who's like not very chill with queer people, like he can't watch a show that he likes and not see a gay character. Like he has to accept the gay character on the shows that he likes, right? So maybe that's, he chooses certain shows, but like the ones that he likes, there always is at least one in kind of the main ensemble cast. And she feels like that's making a difference for him. And so that's really nice to see that, like, yes, we still have to look for it. But like, even when we look at reality TV, like when you're talking about how it's kind of like mental health, media as mental health. Queer Eye is, again, people have opinions about it, but it was like, boom, came on the scene, very popular, and showing queer people in this like actively wholesome light, that like, not only are we gonna come help you, like, we're not threatening and we're gonna come help you, but like, we're gonna help you be a better person, not just look better. Like the reboot, I think, was really political in that way. And then of course they followed it up with the like wholesome, good feeling Netflix show where 3 gay men help straight people have weddings. Like as if straight people weren't already having weddings. So that was like a weird follow-up. Like, again, it was trying to be like, we're so happy and we're so supportive and we're not scary. And like, queer people of color, again, like queer men, mostly of color, but and white gay men, but like baby steps, and they are building up, I think.
What's interesting is, though, the extent to which, Marty, you were just describing something that sounds like the model minority stereotype, and makes me think about, at what point will it be okay for us to have queer villains and not, see it as how it has been in the past, how it's like, oh, they're villainizing queer people. No, it's just a villain who's queer. It is that idea of the model minority, I think, that may be engaging with in certain areas of this too.
Have some non-binary villains here and there, and sometimes it seems like it's supposed to be good representation. We have, Shira, it's a non-binary creator, and Double Trouble is villainish, kind of slightly evil, but really likable. But no, we have, there are, because there's so few characters and a lot of them appear and have 2 lines and go away, sometimes literally, there's not a lot to go on, but some of them are evil.
Well, and I think of, like, again, I do professional wrestling, and AEW has a transgender wrestler wrestles in the women's division. They still basically just have men's division and women's division. So we're still dealing with that issue. And it's possible that they're not allowed to actually have men and women wrestle each other because of TNT. So that's a big issue too. but they have a transgender wrestler who was one of their first women's champions. They never really talk about her as transgender. They always use she, her, hers pronouns. But the character that this wrestler plays, Nyla Rose, is definitely a heel. It's definitely one of the bad people. So you do have that representation. What's interesting is, in getting it kind of, I think, Dean, you were talking about this before, about how it's more, if they're queer, they're also white. This is a queer person who is African-American and Native American too. So there is that intersectionality, but then that kind of gets tied up in the, well, is that why this person's a heel? And is that why this person's a bad guy? And it is still kind of messy and kind of tricky to navigate those intersections.
I mean, I think intersections are, I mean, they're always messy because they mean that you have to think about things in a more complicated and interconnected way. And that's not fun or easy, especially when somebody is saying, like, I'm being shafted in a lot of ways, and you are part of that. You are doing that to me, or you are doing that to people in my community. Then requiring that somebody recognize that there are a lot of ways that they have just learned to be that person, and they don't know, or they've never thought of themselves as somebody who's doing harm or who's contributing to harm being done even indirectly. I mean, that's a lot for people to take. And I say that both, it came up in my research project, of course it did, because these are real people talking about characters who might not be real, but especially if you're talking about film or television, somebody is portraying those characters. So you have this additional layer of the real person and the character and whatever is happening sort of across the board. And then you have the people enjoying that media, or the people responding to it who aren't enjoying that media. And it's much more complicated to then say, well, how do we, like being a villain can be fun. It's essential to our storytelling. You know, it's how we interrupt an easygoing, flowing narrative and like create tensions and do really interesting things. And also how you experience the world for a lot of people. There are hurdles, and some of those hurdles are people. But it becomes much harder to say, well, if I can say, well, that hurdle is because I'm a woman, that's pretty easy. And we can say, well, let's figure out how to solve that problem. Or, well, of course I didn't do that because I don't think poorly of women. But as soon as you say something like, because I'm a Black woman, or because I'm a queer non-binary person, that sort of easy solution, is it my fault or isn't, stops being so obvious. And I think that most people don't like that, right? Like that gray area of like, am I part of the problem? It doesn't feel good. And I'm pessimistic enough to say we're all part of the problem. I don't care who you are part of the problem somewhere. But also, what a great opportunity to think about all of the ways that you can contribute positively and at least be less a part of a problem, at least for some people. And I will say that I'm always going to hedge that because I also am disability studies adjacent. And I think that one of the really important conversations that people are having, especially now with COVID and being in these digital spaces, is that there are some ways of being in the world where the things that you need as accommodations or changes or supports are always directly in conflict with the supports and changes that somebody else needs for their own experiences in the world. And sometimes you can't find a happy middle ground to support both of those needs. Sometimes you just have to address them differently and they can't be together. And I think that's been really important as an addition to thinking about intersectionality, because it gives you another way of saying, like, how much can we do what are the places where we're at an impasse and we need to think more creatively and think out of the box. I think that maybe comes up quite a bit for gender nonconforming people and experiences in the world, where we're saying, well, what do we do? Because we've built pretty much everything to say you only get one. We didn't even build the option of a not this or that category. Like, we didn't even allow for it. And now we have a bunch of people who are in different places in that category that we didn't even put on the books. I think that those create, I mean, of course, tensions, but so many cool interventions and like new ways of interrupting problems and creating solutions.
I just want to say thank you for that. I'm also disability studies adjacent, so I really I'm so here for that. And I also study like technologies and like, yeah, just how, diversity is not built into a lot of programming, right? But going back to the prompt about like, are we allowed to be villains? I think something really interesting that happened was, I really love soap operas. And when I was kind of in middle school was when a lot of the soap operas that my mom and I watch started getting their first like explicitly gay characters. They were almost all like young gay men and they had the like coming out storyline. A lot of them were like, from one of the famous families of whatever show they were on. And like whoever the teenage boy was at that age, okay, coming out storyline is happening now. And then like they had their coming out, they had trials and tribulations along the way, like, oops, got my girlfriend before I found out I was gay, like now I'm a teen dad. But like then insta family, right? Like insta family for the gay characters, and like monogamous, immediate, like first boyfriend, that's it. And then like happily ever after kind of for like 5 years, where like the gays had bad things happen to them, but they were not the bad thing, right? Like they weren't cheating. That's not a thing in soap operas. You can't have people not cheat for 5 years, right? No one died. Like no one had a secret twin. Like, nobody had amnesia and then like, cheated. Like it was crazy. And then like eventually that snapped and like we started getting to have like, I wouldn't say like necessarily like main villainous characters, because you do kind of have those tropes of like mostly good guys who do bad things and mostly bad guys who do good things. I wouldn't say that there were a lot of actively bad guys who were gay, but you started getting like, oh, my ex-boyfriend came to town and now I'm conflicted, right? Like you got the cheating, you had like, the death and the, like, and it wasn't bury your gays because of course they come back, but like it felt like they were afraid to kill them because they were afraid that, you killed off the one gay character, you ruined the one gay couple, right? And so like even on Hollyoaks, which I spoke about earlier, they have like cycles of gay characters where it's like, okay, here's the gay character now. And then like that actor would leave the show, never die. Then they had this next round and like these are the gays. And then they like left into the sunset. Eventually one of them died, but then his partner's like initial boyfriend came back and then they rode off into the sunset, right? So like, and then they had the really big like domestic abuse plot line. And so that was a turning point for them. But it was interesting because the person that they chose to be the victim in that relationship was somebody who had previously been abusive to his girlfriend. And so they took him from like abuser into like victim, and then had this older gay man come in, and they had a really interesting dynamic of, well, you hit women, so you were a bad person. I'm hitting you. You're a man. You could stand up. You could fight back. And the guilt of being previously an abuser and like, feeling kind of like he deserved it. He'd also been like, pushed around by his parents when he was younger. And so like cycles of abuse coming back that way. But it was really interesting to that dynamic. And like, I have not seen that complexity in most of the soaps still. But it like, you know, that man came on the scene and they were like, we're doing gays as villains now. Boom. And then I feel like that kind of broke down the door and other people felt comfortable doing it too. So soaps are like their own weird part of popular culture that I'm not sure that people that don't watch soaps ever have any idea what's going on there. But people who watch soaps tend to watch a lot of different soaps. And so to see such trends be so consistent across like the 7 shows that I watch or whatever for like 5 years was really interesting.
Dean, do you have anything to add here? It is interesting in the sense too of you think about soap operas again, it's commonly thought that they're addressing, you know, the housewife that's at home in the middle of the day, and that again goes back to the mainstream middle America approach. Now, of course, when you say middle school, when was that? Because my middle school was late 80s, early 90s, and definitely didn't see those.
For me, I'm picturing like 2008.
Okay.
Was 8th grade for me. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes more sense to me. Because yeah, and it, because when I was growing up, it was more gay panic, or the any queer character was seen as a threat in some way. And thinking about soaps, I also think about the movie Soap Dish and how you have a trans woman character that is the villain. And part of the whole thing is the character was having a sexual relationship with a man, and when the man found out, he got, you know, physically ill and things like that. So it was definitely positioned in a very different way. But it is good to hear at least that as of 10 years ago, they've really started to make that change in these. And so maybe that brings up the last question then that we can consider as we wrap up this hour, is what other structural changes do you think we need to see more of these types of representation? How if more queer representation within popular culture helps us to have reference for when we talk to each other about these issues and about different identities and the complexities of it all, then how do we accomplish having more of that? Because, you know, solve Hollywood's problem for them right now. Dean?
Small things that come, well, small, 2 things that come to mind are, well, abolishing capitalism, first of all, but promoting alternative platforms, respecting fans' creations, respecting web series. We have a lot of web series with a lot of representation, just the world has to change. We need these characters in order to change the world. The world has changed in order for us to have these characters ship everywhere until, you know, you find a crack and just.
So catch 22, and unless you can find that crack and you can widen it.
Oh, yeah, okay. just go with that wall and use every crack. That's what I got.
Jasmine?
I love that. I mean, this of course comes up a lot for, at least in the sort of fan activity around asexualizing characters and sort of asexual experiences. But there's so much conversation that's just saying, like, we're putting hundreds of thousands of stories and videos and like pieces into public spaces that you can and should be looking at and thinking about and sort of incorporating into your understanding of how to represent characters with these different identities, because you can't have an asexual character that represents all asexual people. There's too much diversity, and that's true of every community in the queer community. There's a lot of diversity. You're only going to get to represent a person per character, maybe a few things, but like a character is a character, and we have millions of people. So thinking about the ways that you can sort of have an informed, like clearly identified character, just by taking advantage of the fact that like we're telling you what our lives are like, we're telling you how we're experiencing the world, the things that we want, the problems we're encountering, the ways that we understand those that are maybe different from how you understand them. Like if you can't read a blog and figure it out for yourself when you're creating those characters, bring a person in, literally anybody who is saying like, let's talk about this, I'm paying attention to this community. Bring them in. If you can't do it, you need to bring in the people who can. It's not any different than any other form of expertise. If it's not your thing and you want it included, bring in the people who can. First of all, pay them. How dare you? Second of all, like, think very critically about who you're bringing in. And this came up a little bit in my project where I was saying, like, because of COVID, I did all of my interviews online. And I sort of recruited pretty openly. I didn't say you have to be asexual, although most people who chose to interview with me were. But one of the things that creates is a really different sense of who's invested in what they're doing, because some of them, especially for the in-person meetup groups, like some of the New York meetups for asexuals, those are mostly or significantly non-binary, non-white people that are coordinating and having really important conversations and talking about how essential it is to share resources, and like moving to a place where people who understand more about your lives and can support you are. That's a really different group of people than the people you get if you're sort of just online or if you're in different online spaces. And I mean, those people are studying this. We're studying this. We have lots and lots of media studies scholars and pop culture scholars who are finding ways to both identify the problems and address them. And like, man, if you're talking to anybody making media, it shouldn't have to be said, but just always going like, don't forget that Google is free. Like, literally look up your keywords and just see who's doing that work, and you talk to them. What can they contribute? What can you learn? Like, you don't have to be 100% correct, but like, not creating it from your own stereotypes and like weird like media producer brains would be super helpful, just in sort of a small way. And I think it's also important to be like, what if you just sort of create more characters that are less hetero and less cis? Like, you don't have to go all the way, just a little bit less, and see what happens. Like, see what happens.
And Marty?
This is short and sweet, and kind of builds off what I think Jasmine was saying of like, let gay people be friends, let queer people be friends, let there be like queer people in community. And I think we see that a lot on queer produced shows. But like, I'm kind of sick of like, and then these are our gay married neighbors, right? Or this is my gay married brother. Or like, I would like people who are queer hang out with other queer people, right? And one, I think having friends desexualizes like queerness inherently, right? Which like queer people can be sexual, but they don't have to be, right? That's the whole point of like ace people exist, right? And like, let's be explicit about that. Ace people are a part of the queer community. They have queer friends, right? They're not like just hanging out in the corner and not having sex and having no friends. Like, It's just, I want queer friendships from, the news and from TV and from film and from fan fiction. I want queer friends all around.
Asexual, aromantic doesn't mean a relationship. It sounds like one of the good things to do would be encourage more listening to others, to different perspectives, and to be open to that. And I think in some ways, maybe capitalism makes that a little bit harder because you do have to fulfill requests to certain people and, power dynamics and whatnot. But if more people do that on their own in their everyday lives, just listen to others, maybe capitalism will have to change. That's if climate change doesn't get us first, I guess. Sorry, Jasmine.
No, I love that. Of course, man, capitalist system not doing us any favors. But it is also one of those moments when you think more about what it means to be in community and the importance of saying, like, sometimes the thing that you need to make is not the thing that is supposed to bring you the most money or get you the most sort of broad audience. Sometimes the thing that you need to make or that you should make is for the people who need it. And that's not something, in our current model, that's not what it's about. It's not about like, well, this is the show that some people need, so this is the show that I'm making. But I think that you see that more. I think you're seeing more and more of that kind of production just with the ease of access to different media creation tools and more people having more access to online spaces and sort of communication technologies. You're getting all sorts of sort of mini YouTube shows and channels that are by and for people with different identities, just to say, like, let's create what we want to see, because until we can change a whole system, this is what we can do. And you're starting to see how, even in a capitalist system, because I'm asexual and because I'm pretty into basically anything that shows queer platonic relationships, like, those videos get shared with me. Everybody who knows anything about me, when they see it, they think of me and they send it. And it means that I get to see more and that I can share more. But they're also sharing those in public spaces. They're sharing it on their Facebook wall with me tagged, or they're sharing it through Twitter in places where other people who don't care and who don't know me can see those things. And I don't think that we can diminish how much work that does, even though it's not like, everybody watch this, this is important for these reasons. Man, like, the movement through different media channels is vital, I think, for finding out what's being made. And I think that Marty and Dean have mentioned, when you have all of these different things circulating, if it resonates, we're going to share it, because many of us are in some form of community. I think that is much, I think that is actually what popular media is. It, I just finished a dissertation, right? And part of our conversation is like, how many, when you publish these academic pieces, what kind of audience do you think you'll get? And dissertations are a weird category, but we're seeing things like this very important scholar, and you're like, maybe 300 people have read that thing in 50 years. And like, I saw a fan fiction that went up yesterday. It has 200,000 words. It's longer than most dissertations. And it had over 100,000 people who'd seen it in 24 hours. Like, what a popular audience is in the context of digital media and being in community with all of these new technologies at our disposal. I don't think that in our capitalist system, what we think of as popular culture really reflects what popular culture has become. And I think that that is a tremendous boon for queer communities and people who are more active in changing the representations we have. Just recognizing really how many people you get to, even just from your little YouTube channel. Stellar podcasts. Oh my gosh, so many good podcasts. And I don't know if you guys have seen it, but I'm sort of waiting for that conversation. Like, what do we do about attention now of what we sort of understand as the popular media, popular culture elements, and what you're actually seeing people engaging with and sharing? I think I'm looking for that conversation. I would be excited for that.
Well, Marty, Dean, anything to add before we wrap things up?
I wanted to add just a small thing to what Marty was saying, because I think you all said this way better than I have to add to, about friendships, which I really love. And I also feel that it's, for me as an aromantic asexual, I feel that it's very relevant, friendships, and like putting them in the center of it. They're very central to everything I care about. I think it reflects in reality, like in what. So a friend of mine took me to see the non-binary or the gender neutral bathroom, the one we have at the university. Now we're both non-binary, and it was one stall. So it's not built for non-binary people who have friends. It's built for lonely non-binary people. And I think, I'm pretty sure no one thought of that. I'm pretty sure it didn't occur to anyone that non-binary people might move in groups because we feel safer and these are our friends and this is our community. And I really, what you saying, both of you, well, all of you were saying about communities and friendships, and yes, I just wanted to say yes.
I both love that bathroom story and I'm just like, not surprised, but just sad. Come on. 2 stalls is not a lot to ask.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the building where my office is has a non-binary restroom that is singular, and also it's in the basement. So points for that.
Oh, it makes me wish I was back at the college, Roskilde University in Denmark, where they didn't have men's or women's bathrooms. They just had bathrooms. And it was this little room you went into, and there were a series of them, and it was fantastic. All right, well, on the bathroom talk, it's a great way to end this conversation. I want to thank Jasmine, Dean, and Marty. I want to thank you all for coming today and to sharing your insights. And yeah, listen more, be open. I think that goes for all of us, whether you're more an established scholar or a younger scholar, or you're not at all interested in scholarship. Listening is such a good skill. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was pretty